Hello, I'm Stephanie Kennan. I'm with McGuire Woods Consulting, and I've been asked to speak to you today about Medicare reimbursement and focus ultrasound. I thought I would focus my remarks today on a proposed rule that CMS made in September that is yet to be finalized that creates a new pathway for breakthrough technologies, as well as codifying reasonable and necessary. And I'll address both of these segments of the rule. The proposed rule comes from an executive order released earlier this year. The president wanted to get newer products to Medicare beneficiaries faster. And it is also the product of a real push by the device industry over the past 4 or 5 years to find new ways to get coverage for breakthrough technologies faster. In fact, they've had legislation introduced in the last 2 Congresses that has had wide bipartisan support. Essentially, if a product goes through the FDA's Breakthrough Device Program and receives market authorization, the day it receives authorization, it can receive national coverage under Medicare for 4 years. The criteria for that FDA program is that the device provides a more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or inevitable debilitating diseases or conditions, and the device represents a breakthrough technology for which there's no approved or clear alternative, or it is in the best interest of the patient. The current system for coverage, as many of you probably have experienced, is long and arduous, and it's kind of a valley of death for innovators because they have to spend so much time working through coverage decisions either at the national level or the local level. As I said, the public comment period of this rule is still open. It goes till November 2nd, and they won't have a finalized rule until next year. Now, if there's a new administration, I would think that this is a rule that the new administration would want to continue to push out. It has so much support that it would be ridiculous not to. It also represents a huge policy leap in a way that is very compatible with both parties' views on what ought to be happening with Medicare. Every new administration is going to want to put their thumbprint on it. That should not hold it up. Actually, what is going to be lengthy is reviewing all of the responses to this rule, because they do ask for a number of specific questions that they're interested in. But as I said, the pathway provides coverage up to 4 years as soon as FDA marketing and authorization is approved at the FDA's breakthrough program. Coverage is only applicable to indications with FDA approval, breakthrough devices with no existing Medicare benefit category or that would be statutorily excluded are excluded from this pathway. And I'll talk about the Medicare benefit category concept in a minute. The CMS is seeing more and more products that are coming to them asking for coverage that don't fit either the drug or the device or any other category that they could possibly fit into. And therefore, because the statute is very specific, CMS cannot cover them. I will give you an example. Several years ago, I represented a company that had developed a cream that uses heat to activate, and it would prevent burns from radiation. This would be obviously of great use to cancer patients in particular. But because of the way it was approved at the FDA, which was not as a drug, and it needed something, anything that created heat, CMS could not put it in the drug product category, nor was it a device, so they could not cover it. CMS is thinking through these issues, but as I said, it's in the underlying statute, so ultimately, Congress will have to address these new products that are coming that don't fit the box. Let me talk a little bit about the current system for coverage versus this new pathway. Currently, coverage is attained by a national coverage decision. That means working with CMS. That takes probably about a year, maybe a little longer. The other alternative to that is local coverage decision, and that's going to Medicare contractor by Medicare contractor by Medicare contractor. With a national coverage decision, if you get a bad decision, meaning they won't cover it or it's so restrictive that it's pretty much useless, you've pretty much foreclosed all the other pathways. The local coverage decision process means you could get inconsistent coverage. Ultimately, you may end up getting coverage through all the MACs, but it takes a long time. It can take longer than a year. The other ways are the clinical trial policy national coverage decision, also known as coverage with development, and the parallel review program, with concurrent review by the FDA and CMS. Not many products have gone through that program, and it really requires two agencies with two different purposes who don't speak the same language to talk to each other about a product. So not many products have gone through this. The new pathway, which would run alongside these for breakthrough technologies, provides coverage up to 4 years. The only reason it wouldn't get coverage or be in the pathway is if it were the subject of a national coverage decision, the manufacturer withdraws the product, or somehow the product becomes otherwise non-covered through law or regulation. But what would happen after 4 years? At the end of 4 years, CMS proposes that the device should fall into one of the following outcomes: a national coverage decision, either affirmatively covering it, putting restrictions on it, or not covering it at all, or that the local coverage decision process would start to kick in and that the MACs at their discretion would start to cover the device. CMS asked some questions about that, though, and I'll get to in a moment. One of the things that CMS says in the proposed rule is that they're planning, once they implement the rule, to go back and pick up devices from 2019 and 2020. As of the release of the rule on the 1st of September, there were only 16 devices that fit that category. So the ultimate issue is that while this represents a huge jump in policy, it may in fact be limited in scope. That's where the reasonable and necessary provisions come in that I'll talk about in a few minutes. CMS has asked a number of questions to stakeholders that they're looking for responses in the public comment period, and this tells you where the agency is thinking. One of the questions was, should CMS open a national coverage analysis if a MAC has not issued an LCD, local coverage decision, within 6 months of the expiration of the pathway period for a specific device? In other words, if it goes through the 4 years and nobody does anything, should they take action to do a national coverage decision? What should be included in the pathway? So far as the rule is written, it's just devices that go through the FDA breakthrough program. Should they be including diagnostics, drugs, and biologics that use breakthrough or accelerated processes at the FDA? Should they require or incentivize manufacturers to provide data on outcomes, or should CMS obligate manufacturers to enter into a clinical study similar to the coverage with evidence development while still in the pathway? Should CMS require manufacturers to opt in or opt out of the pathway? It is currently written as a voluntary pathway. And what they're asking here is, do you affirmatively opt in or do you affirmatively opt out of it? They couldn't make up their minds. One that's a little bit controversial is, should off-label use be covered and under what circumstances? Manufacturers would always love to have off-label uses covered. Congress is not so wild about off-label use, and every few years they have a debate about off-label use. So it'll be interesting to see what CMS decides to do on that one. The other question is much broader, and I think hints at what they're starting to look at, which is how to change the review process in general. And should any of the existing pathways be modified to further the goals of the proposed program? That's a very broad question. The second part of the rule is about codifying reasonable and necessary. CMS has never codified that concept, which is odd since most of Medicare coverage revolves around whether the product or service is reasonable and necessary. MACs generally make the determination as to whether a service is reasonable and necessary on a claim-by-claim basis or a case-by-case basis. Under the proposed rule, there are 3 criteria that you would have to meet. And the third one has 2 options, and that is where they get creative with policy. The first option, the first part of the criteria is the product or service safe and effective. The second is it must not be experimental or investigational. The third is appropriate for Medicare patients, including the duration and frequency that is considered appropriate for the item or service. To meet that criterion, there are 2 options. One is the item or service adhering to best medical practice standards? Is it furnished by qualified personnel? Is it in a qualified healthcare setting? And is it at least as beneficial as an existing and available medically approved alternative? Option B is the item or service covered by commercial insurance plans, except where evidence indicates that there are clinically relevant differences between Medicare beneficiaries and commercially insured individuals. If the item or service meets either option A or B, it's considered to have met the third criterion and then would be considered reasonable and necessary. One of the key considerations related to policy is that in linking the eligibility for Medicare coverage in part to private payer covered policies, this may give MACs increased flexibility to cover novel items and services. And this would help those products that are not going through the breakthrough pathway, they believe. This does mean going largely through a local coverage decision process. However, there are very few details concerning this proposal related to the MACs. If there were 4 commercial insurers covering something and they had 4 very different policies, which policy would be the controlling policy? The least restrictive, the most restrictive, or none of them? And the MACs, should the MACs make their own policy? What's also not spelled out in the proposed rule is how much discretion the MACs would really have in terms of retaining what they already do and just determining reasonable and necessary. CMS thinks that by providing a clearer definition of reasonable and necessary, they will be giving innovators more predictability when they start to talk about coverage. And most people have so far commented that they do think this is a helpful thing to do. As I said, the rule will not be finalized until next year, and it probably won't be early next year. It'll probably be in the middle of the year. And I will look forward to coming back and reporting to you about the effect of the rule, whether it's truly as limited in scope or if they've been able to broaden the scope. Thank you very much.